What if there were a medicine that could heal almost anything?
That would be great.
But they didn't want you to know about it.
Sorry, who's they?
Some people are following me, and I brought my tortoise.
From executive producers Mike Judge and Greg Daniels and co-creators Joe Bennett and Steve Healy comes an animated comedy thriller about what it takes to change the world. Common Side Effects. New episodes, Sundays at 11:30 p.m. on Adult Swim. Now streaming on Max.
This episode is brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Didn't file with TurboTax last year? That's in the past. Now, Taxes is getting the TurboTax app and filing your own taxes for free if you didn't file with them last year. File by February 18th. All tax forms, all 100% free. Now, this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. New filers and filers who didn't use TurboTax last year only must start and file your own taxes in-app by February 18th. Excludes TurboTax Live. Full terms at TurboTax.com.
Hello and welcome to The Shift, the podcast that aims to tell the no-holds-barred truth about being a woman post-40. Created and hosted by me, writer and broadcaster Sam Baker. Every so often, you get the chance to interview someone whose work has fascinated you forever. And today is one of those days. Miranda July is an artist, performer, filmmaker and writer who has been doing it very much her own way since she was in her teens. She's made 3 films, The Future, Me and You and Everyone We Know, and Kajillionaire. She's held countless exhibitions, written several books, won a bunch of awards. You get the picture. Now 50, Miranda has turned her attention to midlife with her first novel in a decade. All Fours is a painful, poignant, hilarious, and extremely hot exploration of what happens when a curious, creative, sexually active woman reaches the midpoint of her life, goes off the estrogen cliff, and starts to question her direction. It is wholly unlike anything else I've ever read about this life stage, and it is sure to change plenty of games.
My life changed, and in ways that my 30-something self would delight in, would actually be like, I want that. I want my home to be like that.
Miranda joined me to talk about her own trip off the estrogen cliff, reimagining relationships as we get older, conscious co-parenting, and why she moved into the house in the backyard. We also discussed the Menopause Whisper Network, outing herself as no longer one of the young ones, getting out of the anxiety cul-de-sac, and why aging is unexpectedly wild. So before we start, tell me where you are. Are you in your in your place where you work, the place that you owned before you got together with your partner?
Yeah, the place that I rented for 20 years. And when I met Mike, I moved. It's really just a few minutes away to his house. A sort of twist is that the whole time I rented this place, there's been another little house on the same property behind mine. There's like a little garden and then this other house. And I never went back there or I just ignored that guy who lived back there and worked in here. And a couple of months ago, he suddenly moved out. I took a peek at the place. It was a wreck. It looked kind of like a drug den or something, possibly was. But it had 2 bedrooms. I could see that it was valuable and that there's no other little house that's right in the garden behind my studio. And so I spent the last couple months renovating it, essentially. I mean, it's a rental, but in the only way I know how, which is like kind of as an artist project with another artist. And I just moved in. So now I have this kind of compound and that's where I live. And then, our child goes back and forth and it's pretty wonderful. It's kind of for me, it's sort of a lifelong dream come true. So, yeah.
I think so many people will identify with that kind of, the number of people who say to me, I still like my partner. But I'd rather live on my own. I still like him,
Right. I mean, I should be clear and say at this point, we really, like, we are primarily co-parents, but it was, not in the same way exactly as in the book that we will be talking about, but it was a long, interesting transformation to the point now. And it is true that I had always said to him, like, wouldn't it be nice if we could live in side by side houses, from the start. It is true that that idea was in my head, although now my life, we both have girlfriends and it all looks pretty different, but there is a sense of a return. Yeah.
So what was it that led you to want to write about midlife? Was it what was happening? What came first, the writing or what you were experiencing in your life?
Yeah. I mean, none of that change had started yet. So you can imagine that, like, that was all in my unconscious,
Wow.
My current life, I didn't have access to. So there was a lot coiled up in there and a lot of notes that I had made previous years while I was making my last movie. I put notes in a folder called Novel 2, just a very vague idea of a second novel. And they did tend to revolve around, like, women aging, sort of what femininity meant as you got older, marriage, just the structure of a marriage, desire. Like, so I had no story, but I could see where my interests lay. And I actually intentionally, in the past, I'd been very, like, just waiting for a good idea to strike, and that's the best thing, is a good idea. And then you've got your little safe spot and you can just write away, just write for the next few years. And I thought there's something a little limiting about a good idea, like you should maybe not be that secure or think early. Like, that might eventually, yes, you have to have some sense of a story if you're going to be a fiction writer. And so I held off. I tried to let it grow and grow and just withstand the anxiety of not having a story for as long as possible. And I think I was right for this book, at least.
Yeah, I know it's really enraging every time a female artist writes something and people immediately think it comes from their life. And so I slightly hated myself at the times when I was reading it and was wondering, because, you went from, I think, 45 to 49 writing it, and the character goes from that. I kind of couldn't help myself, but I slightly hated myself for doing it at the same time. But plenty of people have written nonfiction about this life stage and said, it's because I was going through it, nothing existed. I didn't have any information, I didn't know what the hell was going on. So
it is fiction, just to give you a sense of the kind of thing, to sort of remind you how it could be. Like, my narrator is a little bit more naive than me. So, for example, I spoke to many women while I was writing the book who were really blindsided by perimenopause. And that was described to me many, many times. I didn't have that experience. I had the very lucky experience of happening to have a doctor who told me way ahead of time, before anything was even happening, and was like, let's do a blood test. This is exciting. You can, and so you see what I mean? Like, I was like,
yeah, I'm so jealous.
I know it was lucky, and it still was surprising. I still knew enough what that was like, because that's its quality, I think, is like, you're very used to one way of life and, you don't know anything else. So, but at the same time, I'm trying to make a fiction, it was more useful for the story. So that's just to remind you of that. Meanwhile, there's always that sort of pesky problem of, like, what is her job going to be? What's her name going to be?
It's so emotionally resonant. I mean, were you, as you kind of were approaching your mid-40s, were you kind of looking for a roadmap that didn't exist? I mean, what was that process like for you personally?
I felt kind of on fire, like charged up and on fire, and in constant conversation with my best friend, who the book is dedicated to, Isabel Albuquerque, none of that really fit my life exactly. The shape of I felt sort of, I don't see how this is all going to work out without me becoming very bitter. Not that it was so clear exactly what I wanted to change. It just, things seemed, I felt like my desires were all completely contradictory. And like, that was a big problem. And meanwhile, I was headed into this thing that, as smart as I am, as much of a feminist and a former riot girl as I am, it seemed like aging was, this kind of bummer that isn't going to end. It's only going to get more and more. And like, so I got to figure this all out, before that happens, but it's already happening. And so it wasn't like a very together, coherent state, except in these conversations, big truths would come out, like sort of quite radical ideas, some of which are in the book. The idea that we're performing sameness all the time, but for the world, but that actually me and Isabel knew we were always changing. And that was very exciting and painful, and where a lot of our energy came from as artists and just people. So things like that. I mean, that's an example of a more translucent place where like my truth in there is real. It was important when I was in that conversation. And then when I left the conversation, I either felt like I had to hide myself or just worried, lost. Yeah. Or angry.
It is like this. There definitely is this sense, I think. I mean, if I feel like I'm through this now, but I certainly felt when I was in my mid-40s, and I did have a pretty shitty perimenopause. But I just remember this kind of sense of looking up, and it felt like aging was a thing that you weren't like really allowed to do if you were a woman. Mm-hmm. And you it's almost like the options were either you just accept it quietly and shuffle off, or you deny it, and you deny it with every bone in your body, and you have loads of work, and you just make sure you still look 30, but strangely 30.
Yeah.
And it was just so, I think I've seen you say this in an interview, that it's just so weird that you go from being told all these ways to be, all these ways you have to be, and then you turn around and there's suddenly no map. And it takes a while to see that as a positive instead of a negative.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, that was the sense. Like when I would talk to my women friends, there was like, yes, I had this information, but it was very weird to me that there was a kind of like whisper network around what was happening next. I was, when, like with pregnancy, it was like, well, take your pick with which of the 5,000 websites you could learn about what's happening with your body. And, and that was an interesting, to talk to the perimenopause aspect of the book. One thing I did was, I knew some stuff for myself, but I interviewed gynecologists and I interviewed just women who were older than me, because to really try and get a sense of like, what is this like, not just sort of medically and biologically, but like, how does it work out? What does loss feel like? How is it not only bad, and how are you conceiving of yourself now? And for a long time, all those interviews were in the book. And I was trying to sort of educate, but in a novel, and it was very hard. And I was like, somehow I'll do this magic trick. And I think that was a bit because I was having to educate in my life so much, the people around me, that I was like, well, this is really needed. And we're a little behind in some ways in the US from where you guys, I think you're a few years ahead of us.
4 years ago when you started it, we were probably just starting to talk about it. It was starting to be a conversation in the UK, and it very much wasn't, I think, in the States.
Yeah, no, I was looking at that. And I would put out also sometimes questions on my Instagram, and the women from the UK would be like, we are now just starting to get all this. So that was interesting to me. And I sort of had the sense it was coming, but I didn't know in relation to this book, like how that would land. And then at some point while I was writing, a book came out here called What Fresh Hell Is This? About perimenopause, and hunted down that writer and talked to her on the phone and was kind of explained what I was trying to do with the interviews and all the stuff. And she just was like, but how great that you're writing a novel, that you don't, it's like a better form, like people are really going to read that. And she didn't say this, but the way she said it was sort of envy. I was like, oh, right, I don't have to be accurate. In fact, and then there was a New York Times Magazine big article called "Women Have Been Misled About Menopause." So it kind of, the dam broke a bit, and I suddenly realized, oh, what's missing is not just the medical, information about our bodies and the science of it, but thousands of years of sort of mythology. And like, this is one of the great themes, like birth and death and rebirth. And if this happened to men, there would be, many varied and contradictory accounts of this time and what its meaning was. And, just as, the time where teenagers come into puberty, we're not only focused on the biology. They're turning into adults. They're discovering their calling. It's such a big time. There's so much music is just set in that time, and movies. And I thought, oh, right, a novel that's just a story, and where perimenopause is shape-shifty and kind of seen through one woman's, perspective and her desires, her fears. Yeah, I realized the value of that suddenly.
Yeah, it's just such a massive time of change. And I think that point you make, like comparing it with puberty and all the things around puberty, but it's like puberty is treated like a beginning and menopause is treated like an end instead of the beginning of the next thing.
Right.
And it's just kind of crazy. But there's the one thing in the book that just like, it's so mad because I've read so much stuff, but that your graph, the estrogen cliff, oh my God, that is so horrifying. And just for listeners, you're just going to have to buy it and find the estrogen cliff graph for yourself. But it's like, there's the cliff. On the other side, wilderness.
Yeah. You'll see the cover of the book has a, like an 18th century Western expansion cliff. And it took a long time to come to that. It was various versions of a woman's body on the cover. And I knew that wasn't right, but I couldn't find what would make it profound and yet still novelistic and literary. And then I started sending these pictures of cliffs. And pretty quickly, the women at the publishing company, who all happened to be my age, were like, oh, it was like some sort of holy thing we felt we were holding,
Yeah, it's like, because it would have been so easy, wouldn't it, to put a bit of a woman's body on the cover? Yeah. Because it's so much about intimacy and sexuality. Sure. I mean, it's so, much younger women now are writing a lot more about sexuality and reclaiming that. But it's so rare to read a book about sexuality in midlife. Because if it certainly feels to me like it's almost, to go back to that map thing, it's just like, as a young woman, there are all these prescribed ways, not necessarily and actually oppressive. But as an older woman, it is just tumbleweed. It's just like, oh yeah, your libido is probably going to fade, but no biggie.
Yeah. And I really began to feel that, like, how you go through this time, this change in your life does perhaps determine who you want to be next. And so it's like you wouldn't want to miss it for the world. Like it's a chance now for clarity. And be more honest, and you're helped along by your body in doing that. I mean, this is me talking, not the narrator doesn't exactly, she's not exactly there. I think Jordy kind of hints at this. Jordy's like a little, that's her friend. And even from like a doctor's point of view, I've seen doctors say like, it's really important how you, like your health now, what you do for your health now determines like your health at the end of your life, when you're much older. So in a spiritual sense, and just like the logistics of your life, what your days look like, what you spend them doing, it might be something to consider again now.
This episode of The Shift is sponsored by Shopify. Is it just me, or does it seem like everyone is either starting a side hustle or becoming their own boss? And you know what they're hearing a lot? It's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run, and grow your own business. Shopify is the commerce platform revolutionizing millions of businesses, big and small, worldwide. Whether you're selling jeans or juice, books or blusher, Shopify simplifies selling online and in person. Covers all your sales channels from a shop-front-ready POS system to its all-in-one e-commerce platform. It even helps you sell across social media like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And it's full of industry-leading tools that give you complete control without having to learn new skills like design or coding. And thanks to award-winning help and with an extensive business course library, Shopify is ready to support your success every step of the way. What's lovely about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify will be there to empower you with confidence and control to take your business to the next level. It's time to get serious about selling and get Shopify today. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/shift. All lowercase. Go to shopify.co.uk/shift to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/shift. The friendships in the book and that kind of constant connection with other women, it's so pivotal in the book, but it's also, I hear it so often with the women I talk to on the podcast. It's so their relationships with other women have become more and more pivotal, entered, as they've outed themselves, as you put it, as postmenopausal or 50 or whatever the benchmark is. That kind of almost a much more sped up intimacy.
Right. I know. I think I can almost. Sometimes I like listen to these conversations from like my younger self's point of view, so just now I heard like, okay, so you old hens just sit and talk to each other or whatever. I'm going to, whatever. I just did that for a second. And I was like, I guess the thing that's missing from my understanding then that I tried to get in the book a bit is like, it's much wilder and kind of more intense and psychedelic, and that these conversations turn into real things. I mean, these turn into a book, and also like my life changed, and in ways that my 30-something self would delight in, would actually be like, I want that. I want my home to be like that, so I hope to connect the dots a bit, because I think through no fault, it's very hard to speak clearly in a patriarchy. You know what I mean? Like everything is kind of colored. It's like the water colors what you're saying so that it can never, there's like a slide projected over everything, I
mean, you're always endlessly described as fearless. Did you, I suppose firstly, do you feel fearless, but also, did you feel like you had to make yourself more vulnerable in approaching this work? I guess it's both, right? Like you have to be fearless to be vulnerable, like you have to, it was like each thing I wrote
I'd try to write it as if everyone knew what I meant, when in fact I felt very alone. And like a lot of these thoughts were maybe meant to just be passing thoughts that a real, like a sturdy person would just let these ideas blow by, or that maybe I was getting derailed. Maybe I was vain. Maybe it was just me, or it wasn't a big deal. These body changes, there's so many things that said that. It was like more political in a way. Like I really, each time I would, talk to a woman in passing at a party, like the strange intimacies with like a woman who you don't know. And yet in just a few minutes, this real intensity, this kind of secret is exchanged. Marriage, just about how they're feeling in that moment at this party that kind of reveals everything. And then you go on and maybe never talk to her, see her again. But for me during that time, I was like, well, I'm writing this for her, or she's in this book somehow. And it's for her, so that was the grandiosity. It was like, I'm not alone. This book is not just a creative exercise. It's real.
I mean, it really is. I think the thing that you describe of kind of that sense of feeling completely alone when you're writing it. And, am I just making a fuss about nothing? Which is not exactly what you said, but
no, but exactly.
The fact that I absolutely know with 100% confidence, the women who read it and the women who pick it up will be cheering, because, there's such a dearth of stuff about there. And there's starting to be more practical books, but that emotional experience of, the self-doubt, the fork in the road, or I can't remember exactly how you describe it, but that kind of, and that imperative to change. I think so many people will identify with it, and the emotional and psychological shift that you're going through at this time of your life, kind of aside from menopause, like all the stuff, the teenage kids, the ailing parents, the maybe starting to question yourself at work, all of that stuff's going on. And then there's your relationship. And do you want it at all? Do you want it to be what it's been? Because, and I think you get all of that in there. It's all in there. So if that's grandiose, then I'll take it.
Yeah. I mean, it was, it really, these first conversations I'm having, with journalists, and I think the very first ones were just with bookstore owners, who are the first people in the US, people who are only public facing in a small community way, for the most part, were really like, I kind of went in with this energy, almost like feeling so vulnerable. And I remember literally having conversations kind of like this, but being so nervous that I would actually say, like, do you have my back? Kind of like, yeah, you're telling me this, but will you, like, if I'm burned at the stake for this book, will you cry out? Like,
you won't be, but I have your back.
Okay. But I was still living in that level of that feeling. I mean, I quickly sort of fell, into people's arms and was kind of like, oh, I can at least just relax a little bit, but these are still really like the kind of days I would fantasize about, when it was just me and my friend. And I should underline, like, the faith of one's friend in one's project, is not nothing. Like, that really, like, I would kind of get her revved up with these ideas, and she's a little younger than me. So, it wasn't exactly parallel. I had a feeling like I was almost doing this for her, ahead of time. In the book, the characters are, the friends are the same age.
But it's really significant, someone like you who is, cool and successful and respected, just you even writing this book says to younger women, still here. There's like so many different ways to be to age, to be a cool older woman. And there are so many, slightly older women. I mean, I don't mean like 80, I mean like 50, doing really interesting things, but they get so little airtime.
The whole cool thing, I don't think I relate to, some of that is, a construction, right? Yeah. And so sometimes as an artist, I've thought like, well, but just artists are cool, like we're always living differently and dressing different. Like that's not, I haven't broken any real ground there, but I would sometimes smile to myself writing it and think like, well, this is a good use of quote unquote Miranda July, like sort of almost feeling like I was throwing her into the, like, let's use all that whole construction that was made, that coolness, like, let's spend it all here. And that I was, like using every part of the animal kind of. Yeah.
There's a moment in the book where your main character's agent basically says to her effectively, well, you were successful when you were young. And if you live long enough, you might, and work long enough, you might be successful again when you're old. I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of a summation of it. I mean, do you feel like the industry is like that for women?
Yeah. I mean, I think you read enough profiles of really interesting women in their like 80s. Hopefully they're or 90s. Sometimes they're just unbelievably old. You look at the picture and you're like, yeah, I've rarely seen a picture of someone this old. They are going to die. And so there is a kind of sense of like, well, isn't that convenient? They'll be done with. You get the prize at the end, whoever's doing the profile for, not missing the boat, but no resources had to be spent along the way to sustain this person. And that's often what the article's about, is like, there was very little support or resources. And yet I continued to do my work. There's some humor there, also of her. I mean, the whole idea of sort of prizes, because she's talking about having gotten this prize, is a little like, I'm not even sure there should be prizes, for things like this. So I didn't want to place too much weight on that. But it did seem, it reminded me of something very real. Yeah.
You said earlier about outing yourself. Did you feel like professionally you shouldn't, like it would be a bad thing?
I guess I didn't think so much professionally, because actually for a writer, it's okay. And I would actually, as someone who works with actresses, I'm well aware of like that I'm in such a better spot as a director, like I'm in the man spot essentially, right? Not that ageism doesn't, it's in every industry the way it twines with sexism and but there was, I think it more has to do with like a private life, this romance that you think you're having with the world, or or that is possible at any given moment, like, oh, is that gonna end? This sort of like, also I'm a performer, like I perform a lot. Like there's a way in which my, like not in an industry sense, but just my sense of self, I wasn't sure, could I make the same faces? There's a point in the book where she realizes she should stop making a sort of coy look, that it didn't work on an older face, and just, something like that, where it was, and I think it's just like being a young woman, like there is no other use for women but young woman. Like that is a woman. The other thing is barely even a woman. It's not a thing that exists in the culture much. The only power, that I'd wielded was the power of a new person, that kind of extends for a long time, because, even once you're not really young anymore, you're infantilized, you're sort of made more childlike, like instead of accruing a sense of that I now am learning my craft, somehow like every interview is still as if I just stumbled into making some massive project, as if it came to me in a dream or something, so in a way you're kept young, in ways that are frustrating, but also you're unaware that are propping you up, are giving you a certain value that you didn't maybe ask for. But now if that's going to end, well, what else? What is there? Because there's no evidence of what there is that is desirable. Yeah, of course, I'm horrified at all these thoughts, right? I'm like, don't tell my mom, like nobody tell anyone I respect that I'm thinking this way, like this is humiliating that I, of all people, I did begin to think, well, in the end, you've done each thing your own way. Like thought about, turned out I couldn't really do school and, go to college, made my career my own way. Like each of the ages, I was like, you actually like to invent even when something exists, you like to ignore that and build something from scratch. That is your way, even in a practical sense, like curtains, I want to invent how a curtain should work. I can't find the right curtain. I want to make it somehow. Yeah. And so I did begin to think, well, why would this be any different? Like you have the skills, you're good at this. It's like, maybe you've been building to this. You've been doing this for things like curtains that don't matter, so that when faced with something that does matter, you could use the same knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, you've been doing, like you said, you've been doing it your own way since you were 16? I mean, why would you stop now?
I know, but I should say I've done it best in my work. And so to do it in like your home, your personal life, which is probably why the book, like I couldn't have done it in my life without also having a fiction in which to do it. Like it's, in that sense, the book coming out feels a little bit like I'm now passing on a friend, like here, meet my good friend. They really helped me through.
You are in a way. I mean, do you think, did the book, in a way, were you working it through as you wrote the book for yourself as well as for everyone who reads it?
Oh, completely. I mean, and there's a character in the book who says, like fantasy is all good and well up until a certain age. And then you have to have lived experiences or you'll actually, I mean, her math is that's like how you end up with Alzheimer's and stuff is like sort of, I think there's some science missing, but I think there may be some links there. I mean, certainly we know that now that menopause and Alzheimer's are linked. Anyways, so I was also saying that to myself as I was writing, like, don't just write this. Don't be satisfied with just having written it, and been risky that way. You have to also live it, like be a bit braver, have the conversations, do in whatever way you can. So yeah, I guess it is important for me. If I read the book, I would want to know that the woman who, while it was fiction, the woman who wrote it wasn't just cozily tucked away in her,
baking cakes when she finished.
Yeah.
So what does success look like for you now?
Now I think it's more than just career success. In the past, I really was just like, if I could just make a movie, if I could just write a novel, like these things, it was sort of like, I don't care about everything else. I can endure anything, I can make it all work, the rest of it, if I can just be allowed to do this other thing too, which is like very female plight to feel like you're getting away with something to get to do this work. It is a larger life thing now. It has a lot to do with my relationships and just my own fearful places every day in my mind, like little anxious cul-de-sacs I get into. And then in the past, maybe just would have distracted myself out of, and that's how I would have gotten out. And now I weird kind of success. But yeah, I'm very proud now when I stop and think now, what is that feeling? And, you know, who said that to you? Whose voice are you echoing here? You know, that sort of thing, when you just catching myself in the act of some habituated anxiety or kind of self-hatred or something I'm doing that isn't even mine. You know, I think those are really successful moments. I mean, and in terms of the book, I mean, I think we've said it like 9 different times now. Like is this conversation. And I mean, the confusing thing is the audience is global, right? The book is published in all different countries, and the countries are all in very different places. You know, I mean, some of that is cool. And some of that is just like, it's really hard for women to have rights, you know? And so the huge disparity, it's a little hair raising to imagine how this will land everywhere. You know, it's going to be interesting.
How many places, how many countries is it being published in May?
Oh, in May. It's not all in May. You know, some places, you know, like I know Japan is like a year later, like people are on their own schedules. But I think generally most of my books have been, you know, like 23 or to 26 countries.
Yeah, and that's a lot of different experiences. I
expect I'll learn a lot too, you know, like you.
Before I ask you the questions, I always ask one more question. Are you a driver or a parker?
Well, yeah, I am a parker, like my narrator. We have that in common.
You have means,
to. Yeah. We won't say what. Should we not say what it means? It's funny. It sounds like you would want to be a driver, but actually,
no. I think you'd want to be a parker. I convinced myself I was a parker, and I'm sticking with that. But no, they have to buy it, read it, and decide whether they're a driver or a parker. Okay, questions I always ask. What is your emotional age?
It's funny, me and my friends were just talking about this at dinner, and I said something like 6. And then Isabel said, "Oh, but you're also 200 or something like that." And then everyone went, "Right, that's the weird thing. She's 6, but she's 200. And I was like, I guess I can feel that.
Yeah, I think that's doable. What about you is 200, you know?
I think a thing I can't articulate that I have with making things that can become very, like I truly feel like I'm in conversation with something I don't understand, you know, and it's like a little spooky, and I think, and that has I'm like, that is the age of the universe, like that part of me, and perhaps it's in everyone, but there is a part that's like always been here, always going to be here. I tried to let that come into the book a little bit. There's being, you know, getting immediately very surreal, like that's a dimension of reality that, you know, I guess for a lot of people would be like a spiritual realm, but for me, it's through my work. So I think of it as creative.
Give us a book recommendation.
God, there's so many books. Why aren't I? Well, you know, this book actually is just coming out here, but already came out in the UK, the Unruly Bodies, the Lauren Elkin book.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a book, I often just grab a book to read with lunch. And one that I grab, that I'm not necessarily going to reread the whole thing, but I recently grabbed Michelle T's Black Wave. Do you know that book?
No, I haven't read it. No. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, really any of Michelle T's books, but, you know, there's a woman who's my age or a little older who, you know, I kind of look at her and I'm reminded, like, right, if you're queer and an artist and sort of a punk, you just don't really age on some level, you know, like you. And that's that's inspiring to me.
What advice would you give younger women?
I guess whatever you're waiting for, like if you're waiting for something in order to begin, waiting to get done with something or this next chapter or of your life to be done in order to do something, maybe actually just see what you could do right now instead. What little way you could begin now, today, instead of waiting to be ready. And sometimes it's the big long book or screenplay people have been working on for years and years that sometimes is in the way. That sounds awful. Of course, you should just finish it and it'll be great and so forth. But I also think we can be perfectionists and we can get our whole identity tied up in something that can stop who you are in the present. And I do this in a different way because I'm often working on something else just a little bit at the same time. And it's like, I want to just catch the energy, especially when something's a few years in. I just want to catch a little bit of what's now, almost like bottle it so I have it for later. Like, I think there's a way that we can get kind of stuck behind constructions of our own making. And if you can find a little way out, at least for a few bubbles to escape, that can be really worthwhile.
Yeah, and the thing you said earlier about all fours, about not being too prescriptive, about, I think those things can all be such blocks.
Yeah, the idea of what you're doing.
Who is an older woman who inspires you?
So my friend Isabel, who I mentioned now like many times, her mom, Lita Albuquerque, is a established artist in the land art movement. She's someone who's very present in my life because she's present in Isabel's life. And every time I see her, I'm just sort of shocked at like the number of times I've looked up how old she is just to double check. And it is, I just already said the thing about like being an artist keeps you young. She's covered with wrinkles. It's not that. You just want to be around her. It's her eyes, it's her engagement with, her students and her daughters. And yeah.
What's your superpower?
I guess that I'm not afraid to be vulnerable. Like I especially feel it when I'm on stage, which is such a vulnerable place to be, right? You can mess up in front of so many people. It's literally sort of a nightmare waiting to happen every second. But then I feel like I can do anything. I'm safe up here. Like there's something about that just total vulnerability that feels like warm water to me.
Is stage of all the different mediums that you work in, is stage your preferred one?
No. In fact, I'm happy every day also that I don't have to be on stage. I'm not, it's not like that. I don't have a preferred one. And I guess if I had to say which one is driving, both my parents were and are writers, not famous writers, but, I grew up with writing. They ran a publishing company that was in our house the whole time. So I literally grew up like making books. So I'd say that one is like my native, being a writer is like the native land, and everything else is some form of rebellion from that.
And last one, how many fucks do you give?
0. Or at least, under 1.
Is that a relatively new thing?
I think I answered because I thought that was the correct answer.
Yeah.
That it was like the setup of I had to deliver the punchline. But no. Okay. If it's a genuine question, then, yeah, sure. Sometimes 0. Most of the time, like 500 or 600 fucks. Yeah. Way too many fucks. When I'm talking about success for me is, getting out of these sort of anxious cul-de-sacs, like obviously that's, you get there through, giving too many fucks. But that's the human condition, Yeah.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy The Shift and would like to show your appreciation, why not buy me a coffee? Go to www.buymeacoffee.com/The Shift with Sam Baker. You can hear a new episode of The Shift every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please do rate, review, follow, tell your friends, because it really does help other people find us. And if you'd like to know more about my own experience of shifting, my book, The Shift, How I Lost and Found Myself After 40, and you can too, is out now in paperback.